Hello, and welcome to the Great Minds webinar entitled Eureka Math2, Student-Centered Learning and Discourse. My name is Matt Bakey, and I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Mathematics, and I'll be your host for the session this afternoon. We are extremely excited for you to join us for this highly relevant topic, and we have assembled a blockbuster pair of math experts to share their knowledge with you. In addition, we are extremely pleased to announce that Eureka Math2 has achieved a top rating status through a recent review of EdReports. So buckle up, be prepared, and enjoy the next hour or so as we talk about student learning and discourse. Before I introduce our experts, let's briefly go over some of the housekeeping items about today's webinar and the platform that you've accessed. Today's session is being recorded. After completion, a link to today's session recording will be emailed to you within 1 to 2 business days. In addition, a permanent link to the webinar will also live on our website, greatminds.org/webinar. In addition, for those folks who are not able to attend, they will also receive a copy of this recording. Should you encounter any technical difficulties during the session, please select the help option on your control panel as indicated by the red arrow, or call the GoToWebinar helpline at 1-833-851-8340. Again, that's 1-833-851-8340, and they will be able to help you troubleshoot. If you are not able to resolve the technical issue, please remember you will receive a link to the full recording, audio and visual, via email. And finally, while we do have a very packed agenda today, we do encourage all of you to participate and send in your questions about today's topic. On your control panel is a question and answer box designated by the green arrow. Simply type in your question and click send. We have real-time monitors who will review and respond to those questions as best they can. While we may not have enough time to go through a full question and answer session at the end of the presentation, we will compile all questions and generate responses into a document that will be posted to our website within 5 to 7 business days following today's session. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's meet our fantastic math panelists today. Our first speaker is Janelle Duckett. Janelle is dedicated to serving students from disadvantaged areas. She has 13 years of elementary teaching experience in New York and Georgia. Janelle joined the Great Minds team in 2020 and currently serves as an implementation leader for Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. Prior to joining the team, she helped open a charter school in Atlanta where she served as the Director of Curriculum and Culture. Our next speaker is Louisa Hodges. Louisa has 18 years of experience in education as a classroom teacher and a school and district instructional coach. She joined the Great Minds team in 2018 as a Eureka Math Fellow and currently serves as the implementation leader for Eureka Math and Eureka Math2 in Louisiana. She is passionate about seeing students take ownership of their learning and support student-driven instruction in schools. And our final speaker today is Christine Hopkinson. Chrissy is a veteran math teacher and instructional coach who joined Great Minds as a Eureka Math Professional Development Fellow. She was the managing editor for Level 1 Eureka Math2 and our Equip product. Currently, she supports implementation on the product management team. Now, let me turn it over to our math specialist today to walk us through the next hour. Louisa?
Thank you, Matt. So we're so excited to be here with you this afternoon. Today's session is going to provide you with the framework of balanced instruction in Eureka Math2. You'll have some time to experience student-centered learning. You'll also get to explore student-centered instruction, and you'll receive some tips for facilitating discourse and developing that math community in your classroom. We'll end our session today by providing you with some resources on this topic. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Just a second to read that guiding quote. And let's take a second to talk about what does it mean to have an equitable, high quality grade level core math curriculum. Well, we believe at the heart it is a knowledge building curriculum. But what does that really mean? It means knowledge of mathematics, but also knowledge of mathematicians and how to become a mathematician. It also means knowledge of the world, knowledge of people, ourselves, and others. And what helps grow that knowledge tree? Well, first of all, it's that important mathematical rigor. And by that, we mean really understanding the why behind the math, that conceptual understanding, equally developing procedural fluency, and giving students a chance to apply their learning, apply that content in their processes in rigorous, relevant application scenarios. Another important golden thread for us here at Eureka Math is that coherence. Teaching math is a story. Teaching math is a journey. Students don't just experience one grade level at a time. They experience those grade levels over a course of time. And finally, accessibility. Well, actually not finally, in the middle, accessibility. Using understanding for design by learning, understanding by, help me out, universal design for learning. I'm still cool, we got our big mistake out of the way. Also multilingual learners supports, as well as readability and other kinds of accessibility supports, some of which we'll talk about today, like low floor, high ceiling tasks and wordless videos. We're committed to joyful, rigorous engagement in the classroom, not just for the teacher, but for the students too. Instructional routines, ways to talk, and we're going to unpack a little bit of that today. And finally, a research base, particularly around the best pedagogy about how students learn, module design and lesson design that develops content not only in students, but also for teachers. All of these things, this knowledge building curriculum is really supporting these growing, aspiring mathematicians. Aspiring mathematicians are developing those key ideas in mathematics, and they're really employing those processes or mathematical habits of mind.
They're also motivated to make sense of math in the world around them, and they engage in students and student discourse.
And they also have a positive math identity, and they feel like they belong in an inclusive community. So Eureka Math Squared is based on the science of learning research, and it's not just one way of learning and teaching. In the three main instructional models, I is the teacher, we is the teacher and the students, and you is the students. With student-centered instruction being a teaching style that places the focus of teaching on the students rather than the instructor, and teachers and students both serve as partners in the learning process. So in other words, students are taking an active role in their education, with their teacher being there to serve as a facilitator. With both guided and explicit instruction, the teacher is taking more of a lead role in the instruction, whether by questioning and or by modeling. However, all three models within our lessons are engaging with the student students actively, and they're involved in their learning journey. With all three of these instructions, our student groupings might range from whole group, small groups, pairs, and independent. It's a balance of instruction. However, today we'll focus on student-centered instruction.
What I really love what you're talking about, Janelle, is that regardless of the lesson style or the different lesson instructional models within the lesson across the module, what I heard you say is that students are really engaged in the learning. Regardless of the model, it is still hands-on, minds-on, with the student thinking and student ideas at the center of learning. So let's take a minute to define student-centered learning. We really thought a lot about this. What does this mean for us, and how does this define how these tasks and lessons in Eureka Math Squared look? Well, you can see the formula at the top. We start with a real-life, open-ended, or an open middle task. And what that means is that there's lots of choice for the solution pathway and possibly different possible solutions for the students to employ in that problem. At the center is that student thinking. What do they come with? How are they thinking about it? How do they explain it? What content are they using? What real-world connections are they making? And finally, we believe the teacher is the orchestrator of all of this learning. they are have the power to do that really incredible facilitation, to use the right questioning, to really bring all of that together. Well, what's our goal? Our goal for each lesson where this type of student learning is happening is one that all students meet that content objective. And we know what they can do and how they can answer the question, they can do the exit ticket. We want to see evidence of them engaging in the practices of mathematicians, using those habits of mind. And finally, we want to be developing over time that mathematical community where people feel safe, where every student is a valued contributor, and they're developing their identity as not just as a student, but also as an aspiring mathematician.
And one thing I love about the math, Chrissy, is that these things are all built into our curriculum, so teachers don't have to come up with them on their own. They'll have the task, they'll have those ideas for facilitating discourse. So I'm just excited to continue moving forward.
I'm really glad you said that, Louisa, because this kind of learning is really difficult for a new teacher, a veteran teacher, teachers who love math, teachers who maybe don't. It can be very difficult. And so that is a really important point about today, is how to use these resources to help you. Thanks for bringing that up. So we're going to do a little mock moment of some student-centered learning here. This happens to be a student-centered task. It lives in grade 1, module 6, lesson 25. So it's at the end of the year. It's also at the end of the module. This particular beginning of the lesson, what we call a launch, uses one of our 9 core instructional routines. There are some other instructional routines too. And this one is called a math chat. This lesson is about non-routine problems where students have to grapple with things that are not quite obvious, particularly the unit that they might be counting. However, it's also a great chance for them to apply all of the fluency skills that they've learned over kindergarten and first grade, and really helping them be flexible and develop some of that number sense. So the only question after looking at this and noticing and wonder, the teacher says, how many? I'm going to give you a minute to think about how that might sound and look for you. And then we're going to be a little mock classroom here. And while students are working, I might give them a chance to talk in pairs and groups. They might be moving around the room to get different tools like a whiteboard or a number path. And I'm going to be looking for some different strategies and different student thinking that I'm going to want to highlight and maybe show on the document camera and ask those students their thinking. So mathematician Louisa, would you share your thinking, please?
Absolutely. So I decided to count by color groups and add friendly pairs to figure out how many dice there were. So I began by thinking about there are 2 purple dice there on the end, 4 pink that I see, 6 green dice, 4 yellow, 5 light blue, and 4 dark blue. Then from there, I decided to think about making 10 or grouping friendly numbers so that 4 and 10 made 10, so that 4 pink and 6 green, sorry, I said 4 and 10, 4 pink and 6 green made 10.
You're so cool.
And then the 4 yellow and 4 dark blue made 8. And so then I thought about, okay, I can put 10 and 8 together and get 18. And then from there, I saw that I had 2 purple, and that's 2 more to 20. So I see now that I have 20. And then what's left is that 5. So I added the 5 to 20 to get 25 dice.
Wonderful. So now at this point, as the teacher, I feel very tempted to say, yay, Louisa, good job. But instead of that, I'm going to be quiet. And I'm going to ask my students things like, do you agree or disagree? Why or why not? Do you have something to add on? What strategies do you notice Louisa used? Are they the same or different than yours? Do you have any questions for our mathematician that you're not sure about? After we engage in that student-to-student discourse, I may ask another mathematician to share their thinking. Janelle?
So I look at it differently, whereas Louisa counted by looking at the total of dice. I looked at the total of dots. So I did that by counting columns by 2s and then adding my doubles first. So when I counted by 2s and counted each column, I got my first number sentence. And after looking at that first number sentence, I noticed that I can add my doubles. So my next number sentence ended up being 4 plus 8 plus 12 plus 16 plus 10. From there, I noticed that I can use my strategy of making the next 10. So I did that by adding 8 plus 12 to equal 20, as well as 4 plus 16 to equal 20. I still had 10 left over to add, so 40 plus 10 got my total answer of 50 dots.
Thank you. Again, I'd ask students questions, ask them to react, to agree, to disagree. I may invite other mathematicians. For example, I may invite a mathematician to share a way that's more low floor. For example, they would only count the dice by ones. Often I've done this task even in 5th grade, and they come up and they actually touch the dice on the board. Or maybe they were counting by 2s or 1s, just counting all. I might ask students to connect the representations. You can see one is more concrete, one is more pictorial, one is more symbolic. I might ask students to prove, well, we've got 2 different answers here, 25 or 50, which is right. We might have a high ceiling opportunity where students might connect their thinking. Well, if I know there's 25 dice and there's 2 dots each, I know 2 quarters is 50 cents. So they're both right, depending on the unit. We can see lots of math content happening here. But what else is happening?
With many of these activities, students are also engaging with the mathematical practices. So for example, with my solution strategy, I chose to think about my entry point. And for me, that entry point was counting by 2s. That was something that I was familiar with, and I was able to use my prior knowledge to help me get to my solution. I was also able to use doubles, making the next 10, again, connecting my prior knowledge to this new knowledge to help me find my final answer. The entire solution pathway, I'm constantly asking myself, does this make sense? Is my answer correct? Louisa, what MP practice did you use?
So Janelle, I decided to use MP5, or think about using tools appropriately and strategically. So as you could see from that previous math task, I used tools such as paper and pencil because you saw the number bond work and the equation work that I did on paper. But I also used that pictorial number bond as a model to help support me. And I used strategies such as make 10 and doubles, and even 10 plus facts.
Every time we invite students to engage in student-to-student discourse, not every time when they engage in student-to-teacher discourse, but when we ask students to talk to one another, we're asking them to communicate their thinking, to explain their ideas, to justify their ideas, to argue respectfully, one of my favorite things to teach all the students that I've taught over the years. The way that they can do that thinking is through representations, through showing, making visible their learning, whether it's concrete, pictorial, or symbolic. They can start to wonder and actually push each other to justify those arguments a little bit better. They may or may not be using precise mathematical language or units or equations, but the teachers can come in and scaffold that. What's important is that the thinking and the concept of the math content is solid. We can always support that mathematical language.
So we've spoken quite a bit now about how we're really encouraging students to question others about their thinking, their representations, reflect on their own thinking, and just really lift the discourse in the classroom. But how do we do that? Eureka Math2 often uses a framework that supports teachers in orchestrating that productive class discussions around student work and student responses. Applying the 5 steps that we're getting ready to walk through now support student-driven learning, starting with what students know and helping drive towards the objective. So, before giving students a math task, it's helpful to anticipate how students may respond. As a part of the planning process, it's important that as teachers, we're reviewing the lesson vignette sample student responses, and considering doing the math, really understanding what students might do. And then, as students work and engage in conversation, we're monitoring their thinking. We're selecting student work, and we're responding to those student responses and thinking about how are we going to highlight this within our class conversation. It's so important that we're being intentional with the selections and really considering the mathematical goals. From there, we're considering the best way to sequence and share the student thinking. We want to reflect on the order in which the thinking is going to be presented and how can we support students with their movement towards the mathematical objective for the day. It's important that we take into consideration that the suggestions that we offer within the lesson, it's just a suggestion. It may not work for every class, for every teacher. As teachers, you guys know your students the best. In some instances, sequencing from simple to complex may be appropriate, while in other instances, you may choose a work that has a misconception or an inaccuracy that really normalizes the mistakes within the classroom. Finally, we're connecting student work samples to the mathematical objective. We're encouraging our students to interact with the sample work and work with one another using all of those suggestions above. Let's see what the 5 practices framework looks like throughout different tasks within our lessons. Louisa.
Yep, thank you, Janelle. All right, so the first task that we're going to look at is a launch activity from 6th grade, Module 1, Topic C, Lesson 13. And the objective of this lesson is comparing ratio relationships using ratio tables. So we're going to see how the 5 practices are kind of built into this launch activity. I also want to point out that which one doesn't belong is one of our instructional routines. So take a moment as participants and look at the 4 smoothies that you see on the screen and think for yourself, which smoothie doesn't belong? You may want to write your answer down, jot down any thinking that helped you to come up with that solution. Take a moment to do that. When your students are completing this task, they should be emphasizing ratio reasoning. However, the task does offer that low floor, high ceiling for your students. So even if their answers don't emphasize ratio reasoning, it still gives them an entry point into the task. And you as a teacher, some feedback or some data that you have collected on your students to know where to go with them next. So let's take a look at the 5 practices within this task. As you can see from the task vignette, we have the student sample responses there first. So this helps us to anticipate those student responses. But I want to caution you that as you're planning and studying the lesson, you want to go beyond anticipating the responses that are included in the vignette, because sometimes our students may respond differently. Next, you'll see a place where they're asking you to walk around the room and monitor, listen to student conversations, think about what they're saying, and select those responses that you want to highlight for the entire class. When you're selecting those responses, you want to consider that simple to complex movement as you select responses, so that you're thinking about which ones you want to highlight in a sequence from simple to complex, which is part of that 5 practices framework. And then finally, as you're closing out the task with your students, you want to make sure to make connections among the responses that they gave themselves with each other, but then also back to the lesson objective. The launch transition statement helps us to make that connection back to the lesson objective.
I really appreciate, Louisa, how you highlighted that we give something in the vignette, but what happens in your classroom might be different. So if you give them an opportunity to talk with partners or talk in teams, everyone gets their idea shared and validated. But I think for me, for example, in 4th grade, everyone would pick C, right? That'd be pretty obvious, or B, and they'd be thinking about shape and size, right? Or maybe in having some volume thinking coming from 5th grade. And it's very tempting to say, raise your hand if you thought A, raise your hand if you thought B, and to go in order, instead of really listening for those ratio conversations and picking up on them. So I appreciate that teacher advice.
So now we're going to take a moment to look at a grade 3 example. This comes from Module 1, Lesson 23, where the objective is to represent and solve 2-step word problems using both drawings and equations. In this case, the teacher will display the picture that you see on the screen. And we will tell students, on your whiteboards, I would like for you to write equations, expressions, or statements to describe the total number of dots and how they're organized. I will give our students about 3 to 4 minutes to complete this task. And then I will circulate the classroom looking for various representations for those dice for us to go ahead and have a conversation. So let's look at how this 5 practices framework is built into this part of the task. So you can see here where we anticipate some of those student responses that you might get. Again, as Louisa and Chrissy mentioned, With your class, you might have other responses. It's going to be important in that planning process that you consider what your students might say as well. We then help you with that guidance of monitoring, selecting, and sequence, and we point out the different strategies you would want to look for and how to present, such as the commutative property, the break apart and distribute strategy, or using 3 factors to multiply. And then we end with offering you some questions to help guide the conversation, to help with students connecting those student sample works with the mathematical objective for the day. Now, what's really nice about this lesson is that the 5 practices framework is not only in this task, the whole lesson is actually incorporates the 5 practices framework, and Chrissy's going to show us that.
Awesome. Before we look at that next part of the lesson and learn, one thing I was thinking that as a teacher, I might panic here. If this is the beginning of a module or early in a launch or early in a topic, I might think, oh no, my kids don't know these strategies. I need to teach them all and we need to practice them all. And it's going to take me 2 more days. I'm going to make an anchor poster. But really, it's just a way to formally assess your students. And that's probably going to be developed over the course of the topic and the course of the module. And you could do some module study to see that. If it's at the end, then they're getting to choose. They may not need to know all of them, but they might be choosing them for a reason. So like Janelle said, that launch is student-centered, but then the whole body of learn is also student-centered. And here you can see the task, which is a word problem. We do suggest that they use read, draw, write, but that's really to help them with that understanding, perseverance, decontextualizing. But what type of drawing they use, that's entirely up to them, and they have a lot of choice. You can even see that highlighted in the math practice box. Every part of Learn has a purpose statement that develops towards that objective that Janelle had stated about using these types of word problems. And here we see some of those 5 practices coming in, just like we've been talking about. It gives you an opportunity, it reminds you to monitor, tells you how to select, gives you student samples. And then we have a teacher note that's very common that says, uh-oh, my kids didn't do any of this. What should I do? And it gives you a nice pathway to do that. It says select and honor any of the work that your students have, let them talk about it, and consider choosing one of these as an example to show them and to still talk about on their own. Doesn't have to be an I do, we do, you moment. You don't necessarily have to teach it. Here, instead of just a few questions or a few student samples, we actually have a full written out exemplar classroom discussion and how to facilitate it. I will be honest with you, when I read and plan, what I'm really looking at are the models or the representations from students and the questions. What questions do I need to get to ask my class of mathematicians to start to make these connections? And I see there's a turn and talk opportunity to connect. You can always connect representations by simply saying, what's the same about Louisa and Janelle did? What's different? Another type of open-ended lesson is called a counting collection. And so I just wanted to point out that these have very similar characteristics to other student-centered lessons. Students get lots of choices. They get to choose the collection, which is the type of counters, the number of counters, whether there's packages or not. They get to choose how to organize it, how to count it. They have to agree with a partner typically, and they also choose how to record it. Janelle, will you help wrap up what Share, Compare, Connect looks like in lessons?
Yes. So you've noticed that with the K-5 lessons that we've studied thus far, we're noticing this segment or this idea of share, compare, and connect, which really nicely encompasses the 5 practices right there in the lessons for you. So again, after being given a task, which should be either open middle or open-ended, students are choosing the tools and a solution pathway to help them solve. Teachers are monitoring student thinking. They're selecting student representations, again, still being intentional about the representations that they are selecting to show for the entire class for our conversations. We're having our students share their work, explaining their thinking, they're discussing each other's work and asking each other questions. And then finally, we're ending with the teacher asking those various questions to compare and connect the strategies and solutions. We've talked a lot about K-5, and I'm sure you guys may be wondering, okay, well, what does this look like for 6th through high school? Well, Louisa's gonna go ahead and take that for us. Louisa.
Yep, but before I do that, I love the idea here of students having choice in their learning. That creates that buy-in. It's going to help to solidify those skills that they're working on. So I just love that idea of student choice. All right, let's take a moment to look at this in 6th through high school. In 6th through high school, we have modeling lessons that engage students in the modeling process. Through these lessons, they're experiencing those 5 practices. We're going to take a moment to walk through a modeling lesson, but before we do that, let's take some time to watch the launch video from this lesson. As you watch this video, I want you to think about how it's setting up the task for our students.
Before Louisa talks through the lesson, I was just thinking about how many elements there are of good instruction in this video, right? There's no language, so it's accessible to all. All students can see themselves engaging in real life math, and it's fun, a fun context. If they don't have background knowledge of the context, we've kind of given it to them. They now know what an amusement park is. I just think it really combines a lot of great accessibility and engagement features. Oh. Did I? Oh, I'm still cool. Let me go to the lesson. Thank you so much. There you go.
All right, thank you for that, Chrissy. So this is the lesson from which this launch video came. So it's lesson 22, module 2, grade 8. And the objective of the lesson is to model a situation by using the Pythagorean theorem and the distance on a grid to solve the problem. So we can see that that is our goal for this lesson. And we're going to revisit that in the land portion of this lesson, keeping the objective in mind so that we can make those connections throughout. So now let's talk a moment about the anticipate portion of the 5 practices. So the first thing we want to do, of course, to anticipate is to do the math. So you saw that exit ticket on the first page. You want to make sure to complete the exit ticket and anticipate student responses to that exit ticket. As we continue to move forward in the lesson, you see for the launch that we have the purpose statement there that outlines kind of how this is supporting them getting ready for this modeling task that the students are going to do. You also see some questions there, and so it's important for us to anticipate student responses to those questions as we're going through our planning. As we keep moving forward into the learn section, we can see that we're given some ideas on how we need to organize our students, and we also need to continue to think about the questions that we're going to ask. I remember Chrissy saying earlier that it's important for us to consider the questions that we're going to ask and probe students throughout. So we can see in the margin boxes that we have some math practice standard questions. And again, we want to anticipate the responses to those questions as well. As we keep moving forward, we can see that the learn actually points out a place for us to circulate and monitor student progress. So here's where we're monitoring conversations, monitoring the work that they're doing in solving the task. And we're also considering what responses we want to share with the class at this time. So we're selecting, which is part of those 5 practices as well. If we keep going through the lesson plan, we can see some sample responses there that help us to anticipate student responses. But as we've all said, we definitely want to anticipate beyond these sample responses. This might also help us think of the sequence in which we want to select and share those responses with the class. And then as we move into the last page of the lesson, we can see some questions here that can help us to help students make the connections between the different solution paths that they come up with themselves. So being able to make connections between their own work, but then in the land, we see that we can help students make connections back to that learning objective using that question in the land. So as you can see, the lesson provides support for teachers to be able to implement the 5 practices and focus on that student-centered learning in your classroom. But one thing we have to remember, planning is key. As part of the planning process, we should take the opportunity to study the lesson by reviewing that lesson vignette and keeping the 5 practices in mind. The first step in the process is to anticipate student responses. So again, to effectively do that, you want to make sure to take time as a teacher to do the math, work the problem set or the classwork, work the exit tickets and the problems that are inside the vignette, so that you'll have an opportunity to gain insight into the complexities that you'll see in those sequence of problems. It'll also allow you that experience to think how your students are thinking. So you'll be able to process and think about misconceptions they may have. You can also think about the tools that they have available if you take some time yourself to do the math. Also, as part of planning, we should identify opportunities to monitor student thinking throughout the lesson. You saw in that modeling lesson that they gave you a place for monitoring, but you may want to consider more places for monitoring student thinking and thinking about which work you're going to select to share with the entire class. Finally, you want to consider how you will support students throughout the lesson by helping them make connections back to that learning objective. So you really want to make those connections throughout, not just when you get to the land portion of the lesson. We have an implementation guide that has resources for planning inside to help support teachers with guided questions on how to plan for instruction. And now Janelle is going to talk to us about productive struggle.
So you may have noticed, whether it's a 1st grade example, 3rd grade example, 8th grade example, that most of these student-centered lessons or tasks within lessons are a chance for students to engage in productive struggle. But how do we as teachers support students with that productive struggle? Well, it can be through the availability of manipulative toolkits, so that way students feel empowered to choose them. Or maybe having anchor charts, where it's showing different representations and strategies to help them solve. We would also want to encourage our students to use the thinking tool, which can be found in the back of the Learn books, really helping support them with that metacognitive process of going through what can I do before, what can I do during, and what can I do after, and even at the end of each class. Let's take a look at other tools that we have to support classroom discourse with our students.
So definitely as part of this, we want to facilitate classroom discourse with our students, but students need to be taught to engage in math talk. So we need to encourage them to turn to their talking tool, which is in the front part of their learning book, because it provides those general sentence frames and starters that are going to help them organize their thoughts into 4 categories, as you can see there on the screen. In addition to the talking tool, we want to consider providing them with lesson-specific sentence frames or starters as an additional scaffold. Sometimes you'll see those in the margin supports, or you may have to, as a teacher, as you're anticipating student thinking, come up with those additional scaffolds yourself. Instructional routines are also a vehicle for engaging students in math-focused talk. Eureka Math2 has 9 instructional routines, some of which we saw earlier, that are built into the lesson. However, you can use any of those instructional instructional routines in other lessons so that you're able to leverage them more often. Lessons often suggest that we have students process for about 2 minutes after they've had 10 minutes of learning. This includes giving them think, pair, share time and providing them think time before asking students to talk or offering them the use of the whiteboard or math tools to help support their explanations. Consider adding more of these opportunities when students need time to process orally or rehearse before they engage in whole class discussion. I know myself, when I'm in professional development, I like that opportunity to actually talk with another teacher before having to share out. This can be as partner groups or can include some movement in your classroom. For example, you might have students huddle as a team together and share their thinking before moving into a whole class discussion. Or you might have them mingle around the room. I know when I was teaching, I used to love to include music with that. So I would turn on the music really softly, give them a time to go around the room. And then when the music was off, they knew it was time to stop the mingling. To leverage effective student-to-student discourse during turn-in talks and think pair shares, consider strategically partnering your students based on a varied math ability. You might consider their language proficiency or their math ability or both. The first lesson in each one of our modules contains a language support note which suggests ways for strategically partnering your students. And we can see that here at the bottom of the screen. So it gives us some ideas on how we might pair our students. Take a moment to think about the quote that you see here on the screen. In order for students to solidify their understanding, they need to have those opportunities to explain their thinking. This is why it's important to effectively facilitate discourse in mathematics. Remember, Eureka Math2 offers supports for teachers to ask good questions and to ensure that we are not cheating students out of that opportunity to make sense of the math that they are learning. Before responding to student thinking, even if there is an error that occurs, you might want to ask your class to respond or ask your class to see if they have any questions for that student, or provide the student with praise or give a suggestion to help push their thinking. So we want to make sure to elevate student voices in the classroom. That's going to help us see where they are in their learning and give them an opportunity to share their thinking and make sense of the math.
I love that so much. There's nothing more powerful than letting students help one another. When the teacher says good job or the teacher says that's not correct, let me teach you, let me fix that mistake for you, that automatically shuts down their power as a student, as a mathematician. But when we say, hey, what do other people think? And they just engage in that collaborative peer-based conversation, it elevates mistakes as beautiful learning tools, and it preserves that identity and confidence.
So, Christy, Louisa, you guys might agree with me when we say that we've spoken a lot about discourse or reflection, but as teachers, it could be very hard to kind of like let that go and not want to talk, and just kind of letting the power go to our students. So it's going to be important that we really create and build that math community. So when thinking about how do we encourage our students to reflect, I encourage you all to think about the following questions that you see here on the screen. I'll give you a moment to read it before we continue to our next slide. As a reminder, with student-centered instruction, we as teachers serve as the facilitator. So it's really important that we use questions like these, or maybe other questions that you guys may come up with, to really help facilitate students in having that ability to reflect and think and question each other within the math classroom. Along similar lines, Chrissy, when we think about building that math classroom or that math community, it's also going to be important that we create classroom norms. We want to invite all students into the math and really show them that their reasoning, their ways of thinking is valuable. A successful math community begins with a set of norms that support collaboration and build trust. So to establish class norms, we may want to consider holding a class discussion and thinking about what's the difference between class rules versus class norms, where class rules guide classroom safety and efficiency, but class norms describe what the math in the classroom might look, sound, or feel like. So I encourage you all to think about different class norms that you may want to create to help build your class community. And you may do that through asking these different questions that you see on the screen. After having that conversation with your students, you might end up with an anchor chart that looks similar to what you see on the screen below. It takes time. It's going to take space for students to learn and respect the class norms consistently. So definitely make sure that you are reinforcing class norms, that we are recognizing positive behaviors, especially throughout those first few weeks of school.
Janelle, and this makes me think about when I was in the classroom with my students, one way that I ensured that they did respect those class norms was allow them to have buy-in in creating them. So one thing that I would do that first week of school is have students make a list of everything that might hinder their learning. What do they need to have a safe learning environment in their math classroom? And so we would make that list together. And then from that list, we would develop our class norms. So because these are things that they said they need, it helps to give them that buy-in. And then when they create the norms themselves and we all agree on it, it also reminds them that, hey, you created these norms, so we're going to follow by them. And we do revisit them often throughout the year as well.
I love that, Louisa.
It's great in a math closing circle, right? Like a little math meeting.
Yeah.
We're getting towards the end of our thinking, and you might be wondering if you are currently a Eureka Math2 user, or when you're demoing our materials, where are these tasks? Where are these lessons? How do I know where they're going to be? How do I recognize them? Well, we've given you some hints. They're either heavily modeling lessons, including Math Practice 4, or they've got that Share, Compare, Connect, or it's a launch, or it's you can clearly see that the objective has choice embedded in the beginning or the end of a lesson. But the reasons why we put them where they put them is because they drive content. They give students an opportunity to naturally engage in the new math that's about to happen. For example, at the beginning of a third grade fractions module, students engage in a fair sharing, actually in first grade and second grade as well, a fair sharing scenario, and they watch a video and they think about equal shares and fair shares, and they really, they work with sticky notes and come up with lots of different ways to make fair brownies or fair crackers. We are leveraging students' natural ability and intuition and interest in solving real world problems. We're also connecting to skills that they already have from previous years, leveraging that coherence that we've built into the curriculum. Because we haven't taught it first, and we're not modeling it, we're not doing that I do, we do, you do, we're not even guiding it, we're really giving them that chance to reason, to problem solve, to grow in their skills of using habits of mind of mathematicians. Sometimes it happens at the end of a module, and that's because we've built up a toolbox of strategies and tools, and we want them to give choice, and we want them to give reasoning for their choice. Is it more efficient for you? Is it more efficient for the numbers? Why did you choose this tool or this strategy or this solution path? Why do you have a different solution? And really getting them to think critically after a set of learning. It is a great opportunity for formative assessment in the beginning of learning and at the end of learning. You can use what we call the achievement descriptors and be really thinking about, what do my students know? How are they performing as compared to this, or where they should be in the module? And that really helps you do what's most important, customize and differentiate future learning to meet their needs. I really love this quote. Most of us on the Eureka Math2 writing team have used cognitive guided instruction. We engaged in professional development in cognitive guided instruction. Most of us had read these books. I used it in Vermont over 20 years ago. But I really like this quote. where we're really marrying the curriculum, the teacher's knowledge, and the student thinking to come up with really powerful learning. We'd like to end our time here today of giving you some additional resources. On greatminds.org, if you go to Eureka Math2 and then the Knowledge Hub, it'll pop right up. You'll see white papers and webinars. Actually, I think it's called research papers. Under research, you'll find this article around math lessons that support student discourse. It is a summary of the 5 practices. It gives example of how it is in Eureka Math2. And one of the examples that this article does really well that we didn't highlight today is the use of digital lessons and interactives and how they are a great opportunity for student-centered learning. If you have a demo account or you're a current user, if you go to the little I on the bottom right hand of the digital platform, you will see a page called Implement. Implement is a bunch of resources tool to help you implement the curriculum well. Inside of the Implement page, you'll see a tab called Implementation Guides. Louisa was talking about how important they are. At the end of it, you'll see our lesson planning process. But it also has a full article on the non-core routines. Pretty soon we'll have some of the non-core routines in there as well. And a lot of what we talked about today as far as facilitating discourse, 5 practices, community, and then all the procedures for all of those routines are inside of that article. Finally, 2 key books. Both of them are for sale on the NCTM website. They are also PDF downloads. Were really formed the core of research that we did when we wrote Eureka Math2. Taking Action is developed it from principles to action in those 8 effective mathematical practices when teaching. And of course, we referenced lots and lots of times the 5 practices. We encourage you to look at those resources if that's helpful to you.
Great, thank you, Chrissy. Well, we've come to the end of our time today. It concludes our session entitled Eureka Math2, Student-Centered Learning and Discourse. And before we go, I want to send out a special thanks to all of today's presenters, Chrissy Hopkinson, Janelle Duckett, and Louisa Hodges. As we begin to wrap up our session, a couple things. Number one is we'd like to encourage you to take these last few moments to enter any questions you'd like to ask the Q&A panel. We will take a moment or two to try to get to 1 or 2 questions that we have, but because we're close to the top of the hour, probably will be only chance for 1 or 2. So take a moment and enter those in your Q&A panel. Secondly, just a reminder that this session will be recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording, audio and video within 1 to 2 business days following the session, along with all the reference website links, white papers, and other related material that was discussed by the presenters. And then lastly, before I open up Q&A, in just a few moments, once we complete Q&A, you'll receive an online survey as you log out. Please spend a couple moments to give us some feedback about today's session. It helps us greatly plan for future sessions and helps us tailor content for folks like you. So with that, let's go ahead and ask the panelists a couple questions that came up during the Q&A or during the whole session. So the one I wanted to ask was, we had a question that was, how well do diverse learners, including students with reading and math disabilities, respond to this curriculum? Special ed teachers have sometimes expressed concerns over difficulties that students can have with programs heavy in mathematical discourse. Any advice or best practices on how to implement this program successfully with those populations?
One thing that sticks out in my memory, when we were writing, we were piloting along writing, and we had various teachers who were reporting back into us. As we said, I was first grade, but we had a self-contained classroom, and the special ed teacher was the first to write us every week and say, I had my doubts, I wasn't sure when I saw the work if they could do it, and day after day, they were meeting those high expectations. They were getting stronger over time. We always hear, I don't know about when Louisa and Janelle visit schools, when I visit schools, when I demonstrate lessons, I am blown away by the kinds of math talk that students are engaging in, because we're not just asking them to do it. We're building it through all the tools that we gave here today. There are tons of margin notes to help you develop that. anchor charts. We give all the suggestions we give today are built into lessons. The other thing that's really important, it's not just student discourse and not just student-centered lessons that are built low floor, high ceiling. Everything about Eureka Math is built simple to complex and uses concrete, pictorial, abstract, or symbolic. What's important about that is that there are entry options in every module, in every topic, in every lesson, in every problem set for every student. That's why it's so important to do the planning that Louisa was talking about, because you can differentiate and customize lessons to meet the exit ticket, starting at where your students are, working through that ladder of complexity, getting to that exit ticket in a way that's most appropriate for your pacing, for your students, and for your teacher style. We honor teachers. We respect teachers. We are giving you the most educative, knowledge-building materials for yourself so that you, the expert, the rocket scientist, really can bring that together for the students that you have in front of you. I've worked with so many teachers this year who are full inclusion teachers using this for intervention, and it's been so successful. And I just really want to encourage you to go to greatminds.org. It's a little weird because if you are a Eureka Math Squared user, you're in the digital platform. But on our website, greatminds.org, when you go to Eureka Math Squared Knowledge Hub, you're going to find amazing, helpful blogs written by our implementation leaders like Louisa and Janelle. You're going to find white papers and webinars on topics like accessibility, multilingual learners, readability, pacing and planning, RTI. So a lot of those resources we're starting to build to help people with just meeting their students' needs and really ensuring all students are in equitable grade level curriculum.
Perfect. Thanks, Chrissy. Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour here. So just, Chrissy, if you go to the next slide, yep. If what we'd like to do is encourage all of you to visit our website and connect with us on social media. Just like Christy said, we share a lot of content on social media, and we use our website to communicate to those of you who are either considering purchasing Eureka Math Squared as a new program or possibly moving into Eureka Math Squared, or if you're a current user and just using this session to get a little bit more deeper knowledge about the product. We want you to connect with us. First and foremost, as Chrissy said, go to greatminds.org/math. That will be the jumping off point for all things Eureka Math Squared. It will lead you to all the white papers. It will lead you to a lot of great information about the program. And it will also get you to that webinar link that I mentioned earlier in the session, where you can actually see this recording posted as well. So definitely encourage you to check that out, but also check us out and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and LinkedIn. And when you're there, if you do want to give us a shout out, please use the hashtag Eureka Math2. And should you want to receive more information, or if you need to order a sample or talk with a member of our sales team, definitely visit our website, greatminds.org/math, and click Contact Us. And a sales rep or some team members like Louisa, Janelle, or Chrissy will get in contact with you shortly. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you. Happy Teacher Appreciation.
Thank you.